Announced policy of January 9, 2023. The gentleman from Massachusetts, Mr. McGovern, is recognized for 60 minutes as a designee of the minority leader.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. And I rise today to focus on one of the most serious issues of our time, the increasing threat of nuclear weapons. Over decades of negotiations, a multi-layered architecture of nuclear arms control agreements resulted in significant reductions in the total number of nuclear weapons and nuclear warheads in the arsenals of the United States and Russia. It also promoted and built an international consensus to shun nuclear testing and embrace non-proliferation. But today, we face the challenge that the only remaining arms control agreement between the U.S. and Russia, New START, expires in February 2026, just a little over a year from now. The world stands at the brink of a nuclear arms race with no guardrails or no limits. The U.S. has committed itself to modernize its nuclear arsenal over 30 years at a cost estimated to exceed $1.5 trillion. Russia repeatedly has threatened to use nuclear weapons in Ukraine and even against NATO nations for any reason he perceives as the West making threatening moves against Russia. North Korea continues to threaten South Korea, Japan, and the United States with a nuclear strike while forming a new alliance with Russia. China is engaged in a buildup of its own nuclear arsenal. The Pentagon estimates China will likely have 1,500 nuclear warheads by 2035 if the pace of its buildup continues. And Iran may decide to build nuclear weapons following tit-for-tat missile strikes with Israel and the U.S.'s failure to revive negotiations on restoring curbs on Iran's nuclear program. Adding to this uncertain and tense global nuclear security landscape, the American people voted to return Donald Trump to the presidency for a second term. Now, during his first term as president, he withdrew the United States from the Iran nuclear deal and allowed other arms control agreements to expire or for the U.S. to withdraw. But it will be on his shoulders to help the world back away from the brink of the first use or exchange of nuclear weapons since the end of World War II and to avoid a new nuclear arms race with all its financial and geopolitical costs. If he chooses to take on these challenges, he will not find himself alone. In 2017, most of the nations of the world came together to adopt the Treaty on the Prohibition of Nuclear Weapons, TPNW. The treaty is an international agreement that prohibits the development, testing, production, and use of nuclear weapons, and it entered into force in 2021. The TPNW's goals are to eliminate nuclear weapons and reduce global nuclear arsenals to zero. Currently, 93 nations have signed the treaty and 74 have ratified it. Along with my colleague Earl Blumenauer, I am the proud author of HRES 77, a bill that calls on the President to embrace the goals and provisions of the TPNW and make nuclear disarmament the centerpiece of U.S. national security policy. It also calls on the United States to lead a global effort to move the world back from the nuclear brink and to prevent nuclear war by returning to negotiations that advance nuclear arms reduction. And I'm grateful that 43 of my House colleagues have joined this resolution as co-sponsors. I'm also the sponsor of H.R. 3154, the HALT Act, which would freeze current nuclear arsenals and press for a return to the negotiating table. Further, on November 1st, the First Committee on International Peace and Security of the UN General Assembly, delegates voted to study the impacts of nuclear war for the first time since 1989. While there is already a wealth of robust research on the effects of nuclear weapons, this has not been comprehensively brought together in 35 years. During these decades, there has been major progress in climate and scientific modeling tools, and this new study will allow scientists to review the improvements in our understanding of the effects of nuclear war. 144 nations voted in favor of the resolution, including nuclear powers like Germany and nations who suffered from atomic testing in decades past. Only 3 nations opposed: Russia, France, and the UK, with the latter saying this matter has been studied enough. 30 nations abstained, including the United States. And finally, Mr. Speaker, in October, the Nobel Committee decided to award the Nobel Peace Prize for 2024 to the Japanese organization Nihon Hidanki-o. This grassroots movement of atomic bomb survivors from Hiroshima and Nagasaki received the Peace Prize for its efforts to achieve a world free of nuclear weapons and for demonstrating through witness testimony that nuclear weapons must never, ever be used again. The award reminds us most vividly of the human cost of nuclear war. As many of my House colleagues know, for over a decade I've championed the cause of the atomic veterans to be recognized for their sacrifice, suffering, and patriotism in working on U.S. atomic testing and production sites, often with little or no protection from radiation. After years of bipartisan work by Congress, in September 2023, in a moving ceremony, the Pentagon awarded the Atomic Veterans Commemorative Service Medal in person and online to those still surviving atomic veterans and posthumously to their families. But members of the military were not the only ones to suffer. Civilians, especially in the state of Nevada, were also victims of atomic testing. Known as the downwinders, these civilians and their lands suffered from the impact of nuclear radiation and drift carried by wind and water. They, too, deserve to be recognized and honored. Mr. Speaker, what we are talking about here today, my colleagues and I, is a big deal. This issue needs more attention. The relevant committees here in Congress ought to be doing hearings. We ought to be discussing this more and more on the House floor. Because really this is the ultimate question here is the salvation or the destruction of our planet. Certainly, we all can come together to protect not only the people of this country, but the people of the world from nuclear weapons. At this time, I'd like to yield some time to the gentlelady from Maine, Ms. Pingree.
Thank you. Mr. Speaker, I rise today to call on the House to prioritize disarmament diplomacy. 2024 marks 80 years since the world was introduced to nuclear weapons. In that time, there have been several instances when complete catastrophe was at our doorstep. At the height of the Cold War, we narrowly avoided a nuclear exchange during the Cuban Missile Crisis. Thanks to extraordinary leadership, the United States and Soviet Union were able to pull back from the brink at the very last minute. Years later, early warning system errors once again brought us within minutes of a nuclear exchange. And we are not the only countries that have nearly ended life on Earth through nuclear escalation. Today, there are close to 13,000 nuclear weapons across the globe, a figure that continues to rise at an alarming rate because the world is turning away from nuclear non-proliferation treaties. 9 countries currently own nuclear weapons, while 6 others have them stored within their borders. And while many of these countries are historically rational actors within the international community, countries that see nuclear weapons as the ultimate deterrent, the ever-changing state of the world today demands that we not remain complacent. Not all nuclear states are rational actors, and there is no guarantee that rational nuclear states will always remain rational. As Putin continues to attack Ukraine and threaten Europe and the United States with nuclear war, the world is made less safe. As Kim Jong-un supplies Putin with soldiers to fight in Ukraine, North Korea inches closer to launching a nuclear strike. In the Middle East, where ISIS-K is re-emerging in Pakistan amid political and economic instability, the prospect of nuclear weapons falling into the hands of bad actors grows by the day. Years after the Trump administration decided to withdraw from the Iran nuclear deal, we risk another adversary developing a nuclear arsenal. As democracy deteriorates around the globe, even the United States is not impervious to nuclear weapons falling into the hands of extremists. The world today is far different from what it was at the end of World War II, yet our policy towards nuclear weapons has not fundamentally changed. Now, more than ever, we must pursue nuclear disarmament. Rather than bring the world closer to disaster, let us prioritize disarmament diplomacy and make real progress to creating safer, better world for our children, our grandchildren, and all generations to come. I thank the gentleman from Massachusetts for organizing this special hour, and I encourage all members of Congress to co-sponsor House Resolution 77. I yield back the remainder of my time.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. I would now like to yield time to the distinguished gentleman from Illinois, Mr. Foster.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker, and thank you, Representative McGovern, for holding this special hour to discuss the importance of nuclear security. As the only PhD physicist in Congress, I feel I have a special responsibility to join this discussion and to ask what we can do to strengthen our global nuclear security architecture and maintain U.S. leadership in this area. I'm proud to be the co-chair of the Congressional Nuclear Security Working Group, along with Representative Chuck Fleischmann. It's important to continue the dialogue on nuclear security and the significance of arms control, especially as it connects to current events. One of our caucus's main goals is continued engagement on the Hill with external organizations to facilitate awareness of the global threats of nuclear proliferation and nuclear terrorism. It is our hope that through building awareness and generating bipartisan dialogues, we can create practical legislative solutions for these critical national security issues. With the escalation of China's nuclear program, Russian nuclear threats amidst the invasion of Ukraine, Iran's growing nuclear capabilities, the threats by Israeli cabinet members to use its nuclear arsenal against its neighbors, and the escalation of North Korean missile testing, this is not a small task. And above all, we see Ukraine, one of the few governments on earth that has voluntarily given up its nuclear weapons in return for an international promise of territorial integrity. We see it threatened to be abandoned by some, including some in the United States. And if we're going to be successful in confronting these unprecedented challenges, we need to work across party lines as we look at the 119th Congress and beyond. One particular place where we are already working together on a bipartisan manner is at our national laboratories. As the co-chair of the Bipartisan National Labs Caucus, our national labs create the underlying foundation for all of our nuclear security efforts, including nonproliferation and national security priorities that we're here to talk about today. You know, one of the features that you get of being a member of Congress is that if you ask, you can be taken into the room where you're in our national weapons labs, where you can see our nuclear weapons taken apart. And if you enter that room and you talk to the experts about the details of the nuclear weapons, why they're built that way, what the capabilities are, what the implications are if these are detonated, if you don't take your job seriously after entering that room, you're not thinking clearly. And I find that Republicans and Democrats on entering that room, you think about their job in a different way than they would otherwise. And, you know, this whole discussion is even more important than ever as we face uncertain geopolitical environment that pushes against the international rules-based order and towards an age of strategic competition. I find so many of the lessons that were well known by members of Congress during the Cold War seem to have been forgotten today. The simple lesson, for example, that there are weapons that you can own that make you less safe, which was well understood by members of Congress back in the 50s and 60s and seems to have been completely an alien concept to members of Congress today. And that's led, I think, to some very bad policy, like people thinking that hypersonics make you safer, whereas in fact, if you have hypersonics and your enemies know you have hypersonics, they're more likely to react on a hair trigger to anything that looks like a launch against them and not have the time that they need to react rationally. So over the years, I have focused my attention specifically on several areas to strengthen our nuclear security architecture. First and foremost, HRES 1079, a resolution I introduced in the House with 39 other members, supporting arms control and condemning Russia's purported suspension of the participation in the New START treaty. The current extension of New START is set to expire in just over a year, and anyone who remembers previous arms control negotiations know that there's almost no time left to negotiate a subsequent treaty. Additionally, any negotiations, whether with Russia, China, or any other country, require partners who are willing to have discussions on arms control, something that is easier said than done. In a time when traditional channels of dialogue on arms control and strategic stability have been closed or are quiet, we rely even more on keeping alternative channels open. Non-government organizations, scientists, and research institutions kept dialogue open during the worst parts of the Cold War, and we may need to rely on them again to fulfill these roles. Another institution that is crucial in these times will be the International Atomic Energy Commission. We are the IAEA. We are already seeing the incredible hard work that Director General Grossi and his staff are putting into responding to the Russian invasion of Ukraine and the nuclear plants that are being put at risk there, and all the myriad other crises that are at their doorstep. And in recognition of that work, I've also been leading HRES 641, a resolution that highlights the indispensable role that the IAEA plays in strengthening nuclear security and safely around the globe. Again, I thank Representative McGovern for this time and this very important discussion. There's a decent chance that everyone on Earth will spend their last few moments wondering why we did not pay more attention to nuclear weapons, and I don't want to be part of that mistake. So thank you for letting us participate today.
I thank the gentleman for his thoughtful comments and for urging both Democrats and Republicans to learn more about this issue. Democrats and Republicans ought to have a mutual interest in survival, because that's really what is at stake here. I now yield to the gentleman from California, Mr. Garamendi.
Thank you, Congressman McGovern, for putting this together and for the opportunity to speak on this crucial topic. Since their creation, nuclear weapons have shocked the world with their destructive potential and left us grappling with how to limit their dangers. Today, it's even more important than ever that we take steps, however difficult they may seem, to reprioritize de-escalation and prevent a new nuclear arms race. In 1985, President Ronald Reagan and Soviet leader Mikhail Gorbachev, two cold warriors commanding the largest nuclear arsenals on the planet, declared that a nuclear war cannot be won and must never be fought. This profound truth has been repeated often and was reaffirmed by leaders of all 5 nuclear-armed states in 2022. This should serve as both the starting point and the guiding principle in every discussion we have about nuclear weapons. Yet today, we seem to be overlooking the lessons of even the most resolute Cold Warrior strategists that they understood. Despite our successes in eliminating nuclear testing, shrinking stockpiles, and preventing proliferation, we now risk drifting from these hard-fought achievements. Instead of advancing cooperation, we find ourselves amid a resurgence of the same Cold War mindset that once pushed us dangerously close to the brink of nuclear annihilation. The path before us is clear. We must either continue to build on the successes in reducing the risk of nuclear war or return to the insecurity and dangers of the Cold War era. Instead of pursuing the obvious choices, hockey's perspectives on all sides have locked the U.S., Russia, and China into a nuclear buildup, each country racing to develop new long-range missiles, stealth bombers, and space-based systems, fearing the gains of the others and responding with more weapons of their own. Rather than challenging these approaches, Congress continues to authorize steps that are increasing the pace of this new nuclear arms race. This fear-driven rhetoric promotes the dangerous myth that more weapons makes us safer. Yet nothing could be further from the truth. In reality, without arms control agreements, every new weapon we build only fuels an unwinnable race as adversaries respond in kind. When advocates tell us that our nuclear modernization will cost $1.7 trillion, it's difficult to fathom just how much money that truly is. To be clear, the cost is more than the Iraq War cost us over 20 years, and the costs just keep rising. The Sentinel program, which will replace the Minuteman III ICBMs, has already ballooned to $200 billion, an 81% cost overrun. For comparison, we could buy 20 aircraft carriers for the cost of modernizing a few hundred unusable missiles and warheads. For a fraction of the cost, we could keep our current ICBMs, subs, and air-based bombers, but we can continue to spend blindly without ever saying enough. It's fascinating that from across the aisle, deficits seem to matter, but not when it comes to defense. $58 billion for the State Department? Oh, that's excessive. But $200 billion for one-third of our nuclear triad doesn't seem to even prompt a congressional hearing. For the same $200 billion, we could fully fund the National Institutes of Health annual budget for 10 years, or provide universal pre-K education for every child in the U.S. for nearly 30 years. But the cost is not just financial. The soaring price tags of these nuclear programs are shocking in their own right. But it's also the human cost, the cost of our global security, and the increased risk of catastrophic conflict. Congress must reclaim its role in shaping a rational, responsible nuclear strategy, one that prioritizes diplomacy over escalation, de-escalation over deterrence, arms control over arms races. The American people deserve a government that works to reduce risks, not magnify them. We must rebalance our focus towards arms control, recognizing that diplomatic engagement and meaningful treaties are proven tools for reducing the global stockpiles of nuclear weapons and curbing the spread of those weapons. These efforts demand our unwavering commitment. History has shown that reliance on nuclear arsenals as the core of our security is misguided. With nuclear stockpiles increasing worldwide, our collective call for restraint and de-escalation is more crucial now than ever. Our diplomatic efforts should match the intensity of our military programs. This requires making difficult choices, ensuring that our limited resources support our true long-term security goals. Pouring billions into nuclear modernization while neglecting diplomatic initiatives is not a sustainable strategy. It's a trajectory towards greater danger and increased instability. I stand before you today to say that we still have a choice. We can choose to invest in a future that prioritizes dialogue and cooperation. We can choose to modernize our thinking rather than just our weapons. And we can choose to move towards the total elimination of nuclear weapons, recognizing that it is the only true way to ensure a safer world for future generations. The road ahead is not going to be easy, but it is clear. Let us reaffirm our commitment to arms control, to oversight, and to a nuclear policy based on reason, based on restraint, not fear and reflex. Let us continue to work together for a world free of nuclear weapons, where security is based on peace and cooperation, not the perpetual threat of annihilation. Mr. McGovern, thank you. I yield back.
I thank the gentleman from California for his powerful remarks. I want to thank him also for being the co-chair of the Nuclear Weapons and Arms Control Working Group. And now I'm going to yield to the other co-chair of the Nuclear Weapons and Arms Control Working Group, the gentleman from Virginia, Mr. Byer.
Thank you, Mr. McGovern. I stand with my colleagues today to help raise the alarm about our unsustainable and reckless nuclear posture. Sadly, we have come a long way in the wrong direction since Ronald Reagan and Mikhail Gorbachev pledged to rid the world of nuclear weapons. Many of my friends in this chamber, particularly on the Republican side of the aisle, speak passionately and eloquently about our fiscal trajectory and the rising national debt. I share their concerns,
and believe we need to be clear-eyed about the scale of increasingly serious debt problem and must carefully consider the merits of additional spending in a difficult fiscal environment. Yet many seem to forget this issue when it comes to the larger defense budget, and specifically our nuclear weapons modernization program. The CBO estimates it will cost us over $1.5 trillion over the next 30 years, $800 billion over the next 10, but please remember, our current estimates of defense costs are always wrong, and they're always wrong on the low side. We always underestimate significantly, sometimes dramatically. And while I appreciate the need for nuclear deterrence, particularly with Russian saber rattling and an expanding Chinese nuclear arsenal, our spending priorities and nuclear strategy are becoming divorced from reality, a reality of scarce resources and a variety of competing national security priorities. We're on track in the next NDAA to authorize billions of additional dollars in spending on a host of unnecessary nuclear programs that have, at best, a marginal benefit to our national security and, at worst, destabilize the fragile peace we have today. For example, the measure being negotiated would likely have us continue to pour billions into a new nuclear sea-launched cruise missile program, which is a costly solution to a non-existent problem. There's absolutely no reason to believe that Russia or China would be any more deterred from using nuclear weapons if we were able to field yet another low-yield weapon. We already deploy a vast array of such weapons. The reality is that our current nuclear arsenal presents more than enough a deterrent to our adversaries, and we simply do not have the resources to spend lavishly on redundant nuclear weapons systems while also maintaining and modernizing our conventional military capabilities. I'm deeply concerned that while we continue to overspend on our nuclear arsenal, we're neglecting to engage in meaningful nuclear disarmament diplomacy on the international stage, which is the only real way to safeguard the country and the world from the horrors of nuclear war. I applaud the Biden administration offering last year to discuss, without preconditions, a new nuclear arms framework with Russia and a separate bilateral nuclear risk reduction arrangement with China. But we need to do more in Congress to support these efforts and encourage the next administration to carry the torch. At the very least, before the expiration of the New START treaty in 2026, the U.S. should propose to Russia that both sides maintain the current limits on the numbers of deployed strategic nuclear weapons until a more comprehensive agreement can be reached. Looking ahead, the cornerstone of future arms control talks should be the adoption of a no first use policy when it comes to our own nuclear arsenal. Currently, the U.S. President has the ability to order the launch of hundreds of nuclear warheads within 15 minutes, with no oversight or input required from anyone else, including Congress. Vesting this much power into one person, Democrat or Republican, is irresponsible, dangerous, and unnecessary. Given our massive conventional military advantages over our adversaries, there is no plausible circumstance that could justify the use of nuclear weapons to respond to a non-nuclear threat. And removing the specter of U.S. nuclear weapons first in a conflict would be an important first step towards increasing strategic stability and slowing down or stopping the global race to develop new nuclear capabilities and advanced conventional strike weapons. In an increasingly unstable world, it is incumbent on all of us here to reduce the existential risk of nuclear war in every way we can. And let me explain my use of the term existential, about actual existence. While we fret over who won or lost any given election, we must not forget the real danger, the real challenge is the continuation of humanity itself. Will we live as a species or will we die? That is the simple question before us. I yield back.
Thank the gentleman for his remarks and again for reminding us how costly the nuclear arms race is. American people want us to spend money on them and not on weapons that, if ever used, could destroy this entire planet. I'm now proud to yield to the gentlewoman from Michigan, Ms. Tlaib.
We know, Mr. Speaker, that a nuclear war cannot be won and must never be fought. There are roughly 13,000 nuclear weapons currently stored in bunkers, missiles silos, warehouses, airfields, Navy bases all around the world. One warhead has the power to wipe out an entire city. A full-scale nuclear war could devastate life as we know it. The catastrophic risks posed by nuclear weapons are growing. We know that Putin continues to recklessly threaten the use of nuclear force in the war in Ukraine, as well as genocidal maniac Netanyahu continues to recklessly raise the nuclear threat level all across the Middle East. The White House and Congress need to double down on efforts to work towards diplomacy and negotiate new constraints to cap and further reduce nuclear arsenals. We must implement a new nuclear arms control framework to prevent an unrestrained nuclear arms race. It is absolutely terrifying, Mr. Speaker, for many of our residents in the United States that the President of the United States has the power to just decide to launch a nuclear weapon right now. Think about that for just one moment. The use of just a fraction of the nuclear weapons we possessed, most of which are ready for launch within minutes of an order from any president, would lead to mass destruction in just unprecedented global scale. Members of Congress on both sides of the aisle should back common sense efforts to adopt measures to reduce the risk of nuclear war. We must continue to work towards an international agreement, Mr. Speaker, with all countries that possess nuclear weapons through a very comprehensive nuclear test ban treaty that we already have now. Again, also many of my residents continue to say, stop the United States from being addicted to wars. We could be using so much of these resources to fund clean water, to fund housing, to fund childcare, and so much more that invests in a future, not the end of our world. With that, I yield back.
I thank the gentlelady for her inspiring remarks and for always speaking truth to power. I'm happy to yield now to the gentleman from California, Mr. DeSaulnier.
Thank you, Mr. McGovern. The time for nuclear weapon stockpiling is over. Instead, we should focus on the United States leading the world in disarmament and diplomacy. As the ultimate weapon of war, nuclear weapons should be an absolute last resort or no resort. While with the U.S. having enough nuclear weapons to destroy the world, they become more than a deterrent. They become a threat to ourselves and the rest of the world. Today's landscape paints a picture of even more reasons to act swiftly. The last remaining agreement limiting the world's two largest arsenals is set to expire in 2026. And China has increased its arsenal from 100 to 300 nuclear weapons on their long-range missiles. At the same time, Russian President Vladimir Putin has refused to take up President Biden's offer to discuss a new nuclear arms control framework. China's leaders have also rejected U.S. offers for follow-up talks on nuclear risk reduction and arms control issues. As indiscriminate killers, nuclear weapons will not be the answer to our current or future problems. It is in the world's best interest and the United States as the leader of these interests that we re-engage in efforts to produce a new framework with Russia and China to further cap and reduce nuclear arsenals. I want to thank Mr. McGovern for being a leader on this important issue and bringing us together to discuss it. I yield back.
I thank the gentleman from California for his words. Again, I think what you're hearing today are concerns that many of our constituents share, that we are spending this excessive amount of money on stockpiling nuclear weapons, and the concern that we're not talking about the impact if these weapons were ever used. It would be devastating. I'm now happy to yield to the distinguished gentlelady from Illinois, Ms. Ramirez.
Thank you, Congressman McGovern, for holding this time to discuss the very real threat nuclear weapons represent to our shared safety and our peace. Mr. Speaker, it's been almost 80 years since the beginning of the nuclear age, and given where we are at this precise moment, the risk posed by nuclear weapons feels real, it feels present, and it feels tangible. Despite warnings from advocates and the United Nations, the threat of nuclear escalation is on the rise. In fact, our nation's leadership has played an important role in either mitigating or escalating this dangerous reality. And what we do and how we lead And what we say to the world will continue to be a crucial factor in the nuclear arms race and war in the years to come. And folks, I'm tired of saying it, but words matter. And I quote, "Let it be an arms race. We will outmatch them at every pass and outlast them all." That was the incoming president's answer to the question of a possible nuclear war back in 2016. But we know that as our nation and other states agreed in a 2022 declaration, nuclear war cannot be won and must never be fought. Despite the claims of warmongers, including our president-elect and the military-industrial complex, nuclear weapons are not defensive or an effective strategy for deterrence. Bottom line, nuclear weapons are tools of war, death, and mass destruction. They can't be used without catastrophic humanitarian consequences that violate every single principle of international law and our shared humanity. And we are headed in the wrong direction with a trigger-happy president about to take office. Will he renew the new Strategic Arms Reduction Treaty? Will he ratify the Treaty on the Prohibition of Nuclear Weapons? Will he decrease spending on nuclear weapons or decommission our already massive nuclear arsenal? Of course not. When we invest in nuclear proliferation, I want us to remember that we could be providing assistance in our communities. We could be supporting the education of our children. We could be transforming our infrastructure, delivering nutritious meals to families. We could be assisting first-time home buyers. We could be building a quality healthcare system. Look, I can go on and on and on, and Congressman McGovern would need another 5 special order hours. But what I'm saying is that these are life-giving investments in people. Nuclear weapons only bring total annihilation. We must pursue another path forward. We have to pursue a path towards peace. And we can do that together. Thank you, and I yield back to the gentleman from Massachusetts.
I thank the gentlelady for her powerful remarks. I'm now happy to yield time to the gentlewoman from Nevada, Ms. Titus, who can tell us firsthand about the impacts of nuclear testing on people in nearby areas, not just nearby, but hundreds of miles away, how it not only pollutes the air, but the water and the soil and everything else. So I yield her time.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker, and thank you, Chairman McGovern, Congressman McGovern, for your leadership in this area and for setting up this special order on such an important topic. As a political science professor and a student of the history of nuclear weaponry, and now a member of Congress representing much of southern Nevada, I've learned a thing or two about our nuclear legacy. In fact, I wrote a book on Nevada's atomic heritage called Not in My Backyard. Nevada was the focal point of nuclear development during the Cold War. Over 4 decades, the Nevada test site, which is located just 100 miles north of Las Vegas, hosted over 900 nuclear tests, more than any other place in the country. Throughout the 1950s, the mushroom cloud continued to loom in the distance as people enjoyed what Las Vegas had to offer. It was almost like a tourist attraction. These tests were conducted to better understand the power and impacts of nuclear weapons, and the site played a major role in shaping national and international policies regarding nuclear testing and nonproliferation. The radiation given off by more than 100 atmospheric tests, however, has had devastating impacts on those downwind. And that includes workers at the test site, our atomic soldiers who did war games in the shadow of the detonations, and also sheep herders across the border in Utah. The fallout caused cancer and premature deaths for thousands across the West and contaminated soil in the vicinity of the test site, resulting in a loss of biodiversity. The 800 underground test also resulted in radioactive contamination of groundwater, and that is still a problem today. Radioactivity levels in the water are declining over time, but elements such as plutonium and uranium are likely to pose a risk for thousands of years. Fortunately, the Department of Energy's Stockpile Stewardship Program, the National Nuclear Security Administration, and its nuclear weapons laboratories have been able to certify that our nuclear stockpile remains safe, secure, and reliable without needing to resume explosive testing. You'll remember in 2020, the Trump administration called for a resumption of nuclear testing in the breach of the Comprehensive Nuclear Test Ban Treaty. Back then, I helped lead the charge in the FY21 NDAA process to ensure that explosive nuclear testing could not be resurrected in the United States because it would be right there in Nevada. Now, with the second Trump administration taking office in January, that same disastrous policy from 2020 is featured in Project 2025, and that's the blueprint that we understand Trump is going to be following in his next 4 years. On page 399, Project 2025 calls for the rejection of the Comprehensive Test Ban Treaty, which will not only allow nuclear testing here at home, but will give the green light to other nuclear powers around the world to do the same. The result will put us on a collision course of catastrophic proportions with Russia and China. It will undermine the entire arms control regime, allow for the proliferation of these weapons to non-nuclear states, and it will put the health of Nevadans once again in jeopardy. The United States has been a beacon of non-proliferation and responsible stewardship of nuclear stockpiles. Upon the dissolution of the Soviet Union, we helped newly formed republics like Kazakhstan safely remove and decommission warheads and testing facilities while ushering in a new era of nuclear risk reduction by implementing the Non-Proliferation Treaty, New START, and of course the Comprehensive Test Ban Treaty. Those in favor of resuming nuclear testing under the principle of peace through strength are merely contributing to additional nuclear risks and challenges to strategic stability. Let's be clear, in a nuclear arms race there are no winners, only losers. We must not provide foreign nations with a justification to openly conduct nuclear test explosions while imposing immense financial and health costs on our constituents. The U.S. has been a leader on nuclear risk reduction, and we must continue to act responsibly in that regard. It's one of the most serious things that we face, and we must stand strong against it. Thank you, and I yield back.
I thank the gentlelady, and again, I thank her for being such an advocate on behalf of people who have been victimized by nuclear testing, and we appreciate all the work that you do. I'm now honored to yield to a dear friend who's been a champion on arms control issues for many, many years, the gentlelady from California, Ms. Lee.
Thank you very much. Let me just take a minute to thank you, Mr. McGovern, for this special order, giving me a minute to speak, but also for your tremendous leadership, because this is such an important issue that I think sometimes gets swept under the rug. A couple of things I remember about my last life. I was a very active member of the Sane Freeze nuclear disarmament movement. And then I was working for a phenomenal member of Congress, Congressman Ron Dellums. And I remember we talked about a nuclear weapon and how it's an equalizer. It's an equal opportunity destroyer. And I think everyone in our country and throughout the world need to understand what impacts nuclear weapons have had and will have. Now, I visited Nagasaki, I visited Hiroshima, and I had a chance also to meet with some many children who were survivors of Chernobyl. And I saw what the human impact was. Permanent disabilities, generational trauma, generational DNA changes, physical disabilities. Let me read you what one report explains in a very quick paragraph. It says, nuclear weapons produce ionizing radiation which kills or sickens those exposed, contaminates the environment, and has long-term health consequences, including cancer and genetic disease and damage. And I've seen this with people who had relatives who were impacted by a nuclear bomb and the genetic damage through the generations. Their widespread use in the atmosphere testing has caused grave long-term consequences. Physicians project that some 2.4 million people worldwide will eventually die from cancers due to atmospheric nuclear tests conducted, that's between, mind you, 1945 and 1980. And so, Mr. McGovern, I'm thankful that you're bringing this once again to the attention of this body, because this world should not have one nuclear bomb. Our country should lead the effort for nuclear disarmament, and we should set the standard that the investments that we make in the production of nuclear weapons, we need to reduce this and we need to eliminate nuclear weapons, and we need to be in the lead for that, because yes, again, I will say that a nuclear bomb is an equal opportunity destroyer. Thank you again.
I thank the gentlelady for her leadership on this and so many other issues. Mr. Speaker, during his first term, President Trump was right to initiate talks and try to negotiate a nuclear agreement with North Korea. Perhaps he can be successful at this initiative over the next 4 years. I hope it's something that he decides to prioritize. There are other important nuclear security issues that I hope he'll take to heart, like his Republican predecessors, Ronald Reagan and Dwight Eisenhower, help lead the world away from the brink of a nuclear arms race and a nuclear war. And these include taking a critical look at nuclear modernization to ensure it will provide cost-effective deterrence, hold the Pentagon accountable for unnecessary and costly weapons programs, adhere to the nuclear weapons limits set forth in the new START agreement, extend and expand upon existing arms control engagement, uphold the global taboo on explosive nuclear weapons testing, and stop funding missile defense programs that do not work. Mr. Speaker, I believe we ought to be aspiring to a nuclear weapons-free world. That is what you heard over and over from the members who have spoken here today. But I do want to close with one final thought. Mr. Speaker, when I was in college, I worked my way through college working in the office of Senator George McGovern of South Dakota, no relation, but one of my heroes and a champion on nuclear arms control. And I accompanied him to a debate with William Buckley at Yale University, and the debate was on resolve that the SALT talks are in the interests of the U.S. national security. And McGovern closed that debate by saying this. He said, in 1963, we were debating the limited nuclear test ban agreement, and Senator Everett Dirksen of Illinois took to the floor to close the debate. And he said he had just reread John Hersey's book, Hiroshima, the description of what happened to that great city the morning after. The scene of one family sitting charred around the breakfast table. Out in the yard, bits and pieces of children's clothing, the broken arm of a doll, toys and debris scattered over the landscape. And he said, I thought about that scene, and I said that someday Everett Dirksen will be buried in Illinois. And when that happens, I don't want them to put on my gravestone, he knew about this and he didn't care. And that's the choice, whether we are going to reduce and eventually reverse this nuclear madness. That means not victory for anyone, if it's ever used, but the death of all, and perhaps the death of our planet. Many years ago in ancient wisdom, it was said, I have set before thee two choices, life or death. Therefore choose life, that thee and thy seed may live. And that's the choice I want the United States to make in 1978. So that's how he concluded that debate. That's the choice, Mr. Speaker, I want the United States to make in the year 2024. The stuff that we are talking about here today is not theoretical. It's not just some abstract debate. This is real, and it is shocking that we are not focused more on this issue. Again, Democrats and Republicans ought to have a mutual interest in survival, because if these weapons are ever used, you know, it could mean the end of our planet. You know, as Mr. Foster from Illinois said earlier, you know, we don't want to be looking into the sky and seeing one terrible flash and, you know, and that's the end of it and wondering how we got there. We have it within our power right now to do something to reverse this trend toward nuclear destruction. We just have to have the courage to stand up to the, you know, the defense contractors and all their big money, and to people who, quite frankly, think that the only way we can be strong is through building more and more nuclear weapons. You know, that's not the measure of our strength. The measure of our strength, quite frankly, is, you know, the quality of life of the people in our country. We live in the richest country in the history of the world. We have 47 million people who don't know where the next meal is going to come from. We should all be ashamed of that. It is a national scandal. And when we try to raise that issue on the floor, we're told we don't have the money. Yet we have over $1 trillion to build more nuclear weapons. That's insane. That's mad. And so the plea of all of us here today, to Democrats and Republicans alike, we want the issue of a nuclear-free world. We want that on the table. We want that to be one of our goals. We want to aspire to that goal. And we want Congress, we want Democrats and Republicans to come together and to make that a reality. And I hope that people across this country, you know, get more engaged on this issue and demand more of their government on this issue. Because the trend right now, the way we are headed, it is in the wrong direction. So let's strive for a world free from nuclear weapons. Let's urge the next president. And again, I have great concerns, deep concerns about the next president and his priorities. But you know what? We can't give up hope. And we ought to do everything we can to press him and this Congress to move in a different direction. And with that, Mr. Speaker, I thank all of my colleagues for participating in this special order, and I yield back my time.
The gentleman yields back. The chair will remind members in the gallery that you are a guest. Any mention of approval is violation of the House rules. Does the gentleman from Massachusetts have a motion?
I move that the House do now adjourn.
The question is on the motion to adjourn. Those in favor say yay.
Yay.
Those opposed say no. The yeas have it and the motion is adopted. According to the House, stands adjourned until 10 a.m. tomorrow for the morning hour debate.